All right, it's time for us to go now beyond the podium, joined by Senator Ryan Ferns. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So first, I want to ask you about the Supreme Court. Now, obviously, the impeachment proceedings and everything going on in West Virginia right now with one of the supposed to be separate but equal branches of government here. But as far as a legislative body, what can you do in the future to kind of make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen? What are some checks and balances, maybe?
Well, actually, I think we had a little bit of foresight in that. Before any of this impeachment discussions even began, earlier this year in our legislative session, the legislature passed a resolution that would put on the ballot for the voters to decide. It would be a constitutional amendment to allow the voters to decide if they wanted to amend the West Virginia Constitution to bring the budget of the Supreme Court under the legislature's purview. This is something the legislature, since the new majority, the new Republican majority took power in 2015, something that we've been after. We're able to pass it this year. It will actually be on the ballot this November for the voters. West Virginia is the only state in the entire country where the judiciary branch's budget is not under the direct supervision and authority purview of the legislature. So every year since the previous legislature adopted that rule with the modern budget amendment, the Supreme Court and the judiciary branch submits their budget to the legislature, but we have no authority to change that. If the voters approve this constitutional amendment, that will change. It'll be brought under the legislature's purview and in line with the other 49 states in the United States.
All right, let's jump to roads. Roads, obviously, with the $1 billion going toward improvement in West Virginia, and a lot of people voted for them. It was very widely passed and praised. But how do you think that is going to impact the Ohio Valley, specifically Route 2, one of the major arteries of this portion of the state?
Yeah, well, West Virginia, per capita has actually some of the highest number of miles of state road to maintain. So by comparison to other states, we have a significant number of state roads that we're responsible for. So what's happened is, prior to this year, we had 6 straight years of budget deficits. And prior to that even, previous legislatures did not adequately fund our road fund. So our infrastructure has been neglected for decades, quite frankly, underfunded. So this road bond is an attempt to bring up to speed with that $1 billion that you mentioned, the infrastructure needs around the Ohio Valley. So I talk to people every day about roads. I get calls at my office every day about various roads. Roads across the board, small roads, roads like Route 2, interstates, like I-70 in Wheeling, they're going into Wheeling Tunnel, are all going to see an infusion of funds in order to bring them up to speed. So it's kind of a first step in catching up from the neglect of past legislatures.
Do you think it's going to be worth it then for folks up here, and it's not just going to be focused? Some people have a fear that it's going to be focused in Charleston, or the roads are just going to be maybe I-70, and they're going to be forgotten, their roads.
Right. No, I actually had a 4-hour meeting with Division of Highways a few days ago, and each hour of that meeting was accounted for an hour of focus on each county in my district in the Northern Panhandle. So we spent an hour on Hancock County, an hour on Brooke County, an hour on Ohio County, an hour on Marshall County, and talked about all the various roads. As I mentioned, this funding doesn't just go to big projects. It increases the day-to-day maintenance of side roads and smaller roads as well. So it's across the board, and for the folks who worry about the money going to Charleston, I hear that a lot too. I spent a good bit of time in Charleston. I've been in the Senate for 4 years now. I can tell you the roads are bad everywhere. I've traveled all over West Virginia, southern West Virginia. This neglect that we've seen from past legislatures has been across the state, and it's no different. Division of Highways actually follows a formula that they follow for every road in the state, and it's based on, funding is based on traffic volume. So obviously the higher traffic volume roads do get larger appropriations of dollars, but they're also usually bigger roads, highway type, roadways, and so they actually require more money. But that formula is followed all across the state, and that's how the dollars are allocated.
Let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about the teachers. Obviously, teacher strike was making headlines all across the country.
Yeah.
You took some heat for that, some personal attacks also happening, of course, by folks who supported the teachers going on. How has that weighed on you, and what's next for the teachers?
Well, it was a challenging ordeal to go through, but when I've talked to a lot of teachers since that has ended, and I've been all over my district talking to teachers on a regular basis, the thing that I try to emphasize is to keep in mind that became a very partisan ordeal, and the current leadership in the House and Senate, I think, took a lot of the blame. But the thing that I've reminded many of them is that they didn't get into the place that they're in overnight. This didn't just happen over the course of the last couple of years. They have been underpaid over the course of a number of years. When Republicans took the majority in 2014 and our first year was 2015, we had budget deficits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This year was the first year that we had any surplus whatsoever, and we passed a bill that dedicated all of that surplus to increasing public employee pay. And so I think, if you look at the history of it, I'm 100%, and I've never said anything to the contrary, I'm 100% for paying public employees more. My only hesitation in that whole process, and what I think is my duty as a legislator, is to make sure that the state can afford that before we go writing checks that we can't cash. Through that process, the governor went and made a deal and made a promise with teachers and the teachers' unions saying, I'm going to give you a 5% raise. It's not within his authority to appropriate that money. Appropriation of taxpayer dollars is a function of the legislature. So regardless of what promise he makes, we still have to make sure that the state taxpayers can afford it. And that was what the process was and why it took the time that it did. But I think our primary duty is to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars, and I think that's what we did.
That PEIA task force was created after all this, because that, of course, was a major sticking point. What's the latest on PEIA and possibly fixing it going forward?
Right, so that was an agreement upon all parties, the legislature, the governor's office, teachers' unions, public employee unions, wanting to look at, what can be done with PEIA. And I think I feel like I fully understand the public employees' concern with PEIA. While at the same time that past legislatures weren't giving them enough of a pay increase, their PEIA costs were going up and up, as all health plans across the country have done. What we need to do is find a way to restrain costs of PEIA so that they're not actually coming out with a net loss. We want pay to increase faster than the cost of PEIA so that teachers' compensation, public employees' compensation continues to go up instead of the alternative. What is going to happen? There's a lot of different views on PEIA. There's a lot of different perspectives. Different people are looking for different changes within PEIA. And so, the task force has taken input from people all around the state. The challenging part is going to be able to find one plan that makes the largest number of people happy. You're never going to make 100% of people happy because there's some people that have very specific circumstances that they're concerned about, but that's going to be the overall goal. Healthcare
a challenge for West Virginians in general, not just public employees.
Absolutely.
What can be done to help more folks get covered? Obviously, the tax bill federally, it did give people a tax break in many respects, but it also essentially ended Obamacare, for better or worse. So that help isn't there as much as it was. So what can the state do to help or push for expanded Medicare coverage or Medicaid or what have you across the state?
Well, I wish it had ended Obamacare, but I would disagree a little bit that it essentially ended Obamacare. It ended some of the mandates of Obamacare, but there are large portions of that are still in place. But I do think you make a good point that healthcare is a major concern for all West Virginians. My goal since I've been in the state Senate and will be going forward is to create more job opportunities for people here in West Virginia. If you have a good job with good benefits, then health insurance is no longer a concern for you. The issue within West Virginia and the reason that I ran for office in the first place is people are leaving West Virginia in droves because of lack of opportunities. The more job opportunities that we can bring to West Virginia, the better off our citizens will be. And really, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the issues that we have, lack of funding for public employee pay raises, lack of funding for health care, lack of funding for the opioid crisis. All those things are a result in part of a lack of a growing economy. Our economy has been shrinking, people have been leaving, we have less and less people contributing to the economy. and that results in decreased state funds. So in creating new job opportunities has got to be the #1 priority.
And speaking of those tax cuts, is the average West Virginian seeing enough benefit from that, or is it really benefiting the very wealthy, the big business owners?
I have been to numerous events that President Trump has held here in West Virginia. He's obviously very fond of our state. I think I firmly believe that he looks out for West Virginia and is trying to do things like the tax cuts that are going to benefit everyday people, particularly in West Virginia. Many of the events that I've been to that President Trump spoke at, or even Vice President Pence when he was in Wheeling, had real live testimony from people, West Virginians working here, talking about the bonuses they received from their employers or the extra money that was in their pocket as a result of President Trump's tax cuts, and the real life examples of the things that they were able to improve their everyday life as a result of those. I don't think there's any question that President Trump has, and his tax cut plan, has done phenomenal things for average West Virginians.
And a moment ago you mentioned the opioid crisis. What can be done to help? Obviously the opioid crisis is big across the entire country. It's hitting West Virginia especially hard.
Sure. As I mentioned previously, I think there was a lack of opportunity, a lack of hope for many people, and I think that led many people to begin experimenting with drugs and head down that path that maybe wouldn't have otherwise. Had they remained gainfully employed, had they had real opportunity, had they not lost their jobs, they may have never ventured down that path. But from a legislative standpoint, we took we made significant strides this past year in the legislature, I believe. We passed a number of bills related specifically to the opioid crisis. The most significant of those, I believe, is referred to as the Opioid Reduction Act. This was a bill that was drafted by the Department of Health and Human Resources in West Virginia, came from a lot of the recommendations from the CDC's guidelines on how to curb the use of opioids and how to decrease the amount of opioid prescriptions in the communities. There's obviously, you've heard the stories, you've probably covered the stories. There have been massive amounts of opioids distributed into West Virginia in towns with populations that could never justify those kinds of numbers. The Opioid Reduction Act puts limits and really contains only for the most needy situations should opioids be prescribed. These are very powerful pain killers, and they really shouldn't be for everyday aches and pains. Unfortunately, there's been a history within West Virginia in certain circumstances where they're getting overprescribed on a frequent basis, and that's obviously led to a big part of the problem.
Obviously, West Virginia is very red right now. Sure. Republicans are seeing their time in the Mountain State. Governor Justice even switching parties.
Right.
So do you think that the Republican way is working, and why should voters stick with you instead of going with the Democrats?
I don't think there's any question, if you look at the history of the last 4 years while Republicans have been in the majority, I don't think there's any question that you can, any way that you can question that we're finally headed in a positive direction. As I mentioned earlier in this interview, 4 years ago, when I was elected to the state Senate and Republicans took the majority in West Virginia, we had massive budget deficits in the hundreds of millions of dollars year after year after year. This past year, for the first time in 6 years, we had a surplus in West Virginia. That's a great thing. I mean, everything that we do as a state government costs money. If our budget is shrinking, that means we can provide less services, less pay for public employees, less funding for PEIA, less health care, as you alluded to earlier. Not only has our budget grown and our revenue now exceeding our expenses, in 2017, we had the fastest growing economy in the entire country. That's something that West Virginia may have never been able to say before. We historically have always been on the decline, especially in our lifetime. We've only seen decline in West Virginia up until now. 2017, we had the fastest growing economy in the country. We had the most significant decrease in unemployment. And the state is finally headed in a positive direction. I don't think there's any question, if you look at the changes that occurred in the last 4 years, that you wouldn't want to continue on this path of prosperity.
All right, Brian Ferns, thank you so much for joining me today, and good luck in November.
Thank you very much.